Hey, this is our last installment of the Thinking and Intelligence chapter, and we are, in fact, going to think about intelligence at this point. We've got a lot of data for you, so take some good notes. I've got your study guide up there. That'll be your best friend. And then your discussion board for this chapter will be on intelligence, and I'll make it kind of a fun sort of treasure hunt, guess what your classmates are thinking sort of thing. So what is intelligence? It is our innate ability to solve problems, adapt to the environment, and learn from experience. It relates to a broad array of psychological factors, including memory, learning, perception, language, auditory processing, things like that. I'll give you some more examples. It's often defined by the variable being measured. Okay, so a couple of caveats about thinking about intelligence. It is in part a very cultural construct. So these are Maasai children in Kenya who are going through the motions of starting a fire. They're not actually starting a fire, but they're pretending to. This is their play. So see, this little one is rubbing the sticks together like that. Presumably it's not going to catch fire, although my suspicion is that if it did, they would know how to deal with that. So our kids will play house, and they'll have like a play stove and play food and play plates, and these kids are playing house also, but they're playing building the fire. These children would be considered intelligent if they are able to do that. In our culture, we will tend to value sort of more bookish type things, school type things, as expressions of intelligence. So it's very culturally bound. Definitions of intelligence will vary by culture. I'll never forget this. I heard somebody, there's a little story about formal operational thought. You don't know what that is unless you've taken Lifespan, but the idea is that around age 12, we become able to think sort of abstractly and theoretically about things. And so you might say to somebody in the United States, if you think that they have formal operational thought, you might say, so it turns out that all the bears in Texas are pink. I just came across a bear. What color is the bear? And if they're formal thinkers, they'll probably say pink because you just stipulated to them that all the bears in Texas are pink. But if you say this to somebody in, say, Kenya, who's part of the Maasai tribe, they might say something like, well, I've never been to Texas, so I can't speak about the color of the bears there. Or they might say, what an idiot you are for trying to assert that any bear is pink, because there is no such thing as a pink bear. So they would... This is an example of how culturally bound intelligence is. They would think that we are raving idiots for talking like this, and then we will tend to think, well, why can't you do the logical syllogism? So very culturally bound here. In the United States, intelligence is typically associated with high grades and test scores, but I'm going to share with you some different ideas that look at intelligence in a little bit different way. Elsewhere in the world, being smart may have more to do with knowing how to survive and stay healthy. So they might think that we're, pretty dumb because you can't plop us down in the middle of a river and expect us to survive particularly well, whereas maybe people from a different culture might be able to do that. So I'm going to give you 3 different variations on what is intelligence, and you can think about those, and then you'll do your discussion board on that. So general intelligence, we call this G with a little g. So G is the idea that intelligence is one basic trait, and it involves all of the cognitive abilities, and that people possess those abilities in varying amounts. I have a certain amount of auditory processing. You have a certain amount. I have a certain amount of working memory. You have a different amount, okay? So we can't measure G directly. We have to infer G from these various abilities. So let me show you what those are. So don't worry too much. I know this is a big chart. I just want you to get the gist of this. So, and then I do want you to know these 2 words in particular. So let's just think broadly about this. So I spent a whole semester on an intelligence testing class when I was in graduate school, and we were studying what intelligence is, and then we were using various intelligence tests, and we were finding willing participants who would let us subject them to the intelligence test, and then we would score it. So the one that I remember the most was the one that tested G. And so I remember giving tests that tested all of these abilities. So we might say processing speed. How quickly can you process information that comes in? So I tend to process fairly fast. My husband tends to process very slowly. Now, I'll tell you, my husband is the smartest person I know, definitely smarter than I am, although he'll disagree with that, but that's the truth. But my processing speed is faster. So when a roofer came to talk with us about repairing our roof, the guy's talking a mile a minute, and I could see that Mark was overwhelmed and, kind of like deer in the headlights. And then we went inside after the roofer left, and Mark says, well, did you get any of that? Well, yes, I did, because I have pretty quick processing speed. Broad cognitive speediness, how fast can you take a test? What's your numerical facility? What's your perceptual speed? His is better in terms of this. He has much better numerical facility. My daughter has very fast speediness when it comes to reading. She reads probably twice as fast as I do. Broad retrieval ability, this is often associated with creativity. Can you bring up a bunch of different ideas from your long-term memory? Can you produce a bunch of new ideas very quickly? Can you name things very quickly? If I say to you, name the last 10 movies that you saw or your 5 favorite books, will you be able to produce that pretty quickly and easily? That's broad retrieval ability. Broad auditory perception and broad visual perception. Can you hear well? Do you hear sounds well? My son has fantastic auditory perception. He can hear the difference between 2 notes so clearly. My husband can do that too. I used to practice the piano, and my husband would come and say, can you not hear that you're playing the wrong note? And I'm like, no, I didn't hear it. My daughter has incredible broad visual perception. She sees things that nobody else sees or pays attention to. We'll be watching the football game, and she'll say, why does that sparkly girl, that's our name for the drill team, I think it is, why does that sparkly girl have green gloves instead of blue gloves like everybody else? And we're like, why did you pay attention to that? But she just sees things really, really well. If you were ever good at Where's Waldo, this is you. General memory and learning, what's your memory span? So if I give you 10 letters, how many will you be able to produce? If I say to you, give me 5 words that relate to the word banana, will you be able to do that? So that's memory and learning. If I say, give me all the words that start with the letter S as fast as you can in 1 minute, if you're good at this, you can produce more than people who have a harder time with this. And finally, these 2 I really want you to know and remember for the test. Fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is broad ability to think and learn independent of what you have been taught. So can you do sequential reasoning? Can you do inductive reasoning? Can you do quantitative reasoning with new material and new ideas? Crystallized intelligence, I want you to contrast it with this. This is what have you been taught? How many words do you know? Can you understand a reading passage? What's your vocabulary? How many math facts do you know? Do you know how to go to the post office? Do you know how to check out a book? Do you know the names of all the presidents? So this is your broad ability to think and learn using new material. And this is what do you actually know. So all of these are components of what we call general intelligence, or G. And it was very interesting and fun to use these tests to test people for these abilities. Now, I will say this is the gold standard for thinking about testing intelligence. This is what's being tested in an IQ test. However, there are people who say that's not the best way to think about it. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences has gotten a lot of traction, and you might be attracted to this idea. He initially proposed 8 different facets of intelligence or types of intelligence, and then he later added a 9th. So let's kind of walk through this. So there's linguistic, which is word smart, and then there's logical mathematical, which is logic smart. So remember high school, people were either English people or math people, and as we grow up, that tends to still be the same. I'm much more of a word person than a math person. My husband, again, smartest person I know, he's ridiculously good at both. Some people are just annoying that way, blessed that way, so to speak. Nature smart, some people are very intuitive and intelligent about nature. Jane Goodall, if you remember that, she used to live with the apes, or the crocodile hunter, Steve Irwin, maybe Bear Grylls. You can stick him down in the middle of anywhere, although students usually start to argue with me when I say that. But anyway, these are people who understand nature really well. Spatial, I want you to just ignore this picture, and I want you to ignore that too. It might be picture smart. You might be an artist. You also might be an airplane mechanic. You might be able to pull a car apart and then put it back together again. These are your engineering types. These are the people who fix your plumbing and your air conditioner. These are the people who can read maps. This is the person who can take apart a fan and put it back together. Bodily kinesthetic and music smart, these are also tend to be found in schools. There's either music kids or athletes, right? So body smart, probably this is athletes. It could also be dancers, possibly a physical therapist. Music smart tends to be people who know music. They can probably hear music really well. They could hear a song and produce it with only having heard it once. And then the last 2 up here is intra and interpersonal. So I want you to think about those prefixes there. Inter means between, and intra means within. So an intrapersonally smart person is smart about themselves. They can in themselves and think about who they are and what they're thinking and feeling. But an interpersonally smart person is smart about other people. They can understand other people, sell other people, empathize. So, think Oprah is a good example of this. A person who is self-smart might be, maybe a psychologist would be self-smart. And then the last one that Gardner added later is the existential intelligence. We might call that soul smart. So maybe Buddha or Gandhi or Jesus or Muhammad, something like that. So this probably feels good to you. It feels good to me too. It certainly is a lovely way to interact with students, especially in K through 12, because not everybody, this is the classic book smart stuff up here. But not everybody, is the best at that. Some people are better at spatial, or they're better with people, or bodies, or music. And so this is a way to value all the things that people do. I will say the criticism of this is that people will say that this is not actually intelligence. It's more like ability, or a natural talent, or a skill. And this is not what we even mean by intelligence. That's usually people who believe this is what we mean by intelligence. But this certainly, theory certainly has some traction. And I think it's very useful in K through 12, for sure. The third and final intelligence theory is Stemberg. Stemberg's Triarchic theory of intelligence, analytic, practical, and creative. Analytic tends to be kind of like book smart, where you can process information, solve problems, and evaluate results. Do well in English class and math class, you're probably analytically intelligent. Practical intelligence is really different from that, though. This is how do you deal with the environment? Can you size up a situation and adapt to it? Can you plop somebody down in the middle of Bangalore, and will they be able to survive in their environment? Can you plop them down in the middle of a forest? Can you put them in a dangerous situation, and will they be able to deal with it? A person with analytical intelligence might be able to, but maybe not. Creative intelligence is approaching novel tasks, using what you already know to think originally. And it has to be like originally, effectively. You can't just be like, I'm going to put my pencil through my screen. Nobody does that, but that's not helpful or beautiful. This is taking things, putting them together in a way that solves a problem, creates beauty, creates something new that people will value. So this is Stemberg. So we've got G with the broad variety of cognitive abilities. We've got multiple instances with the 9, and then we've got analytic, practical, and creative. So I'm going to have you do a little bit of a discussion board on that. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Before we do that, though, let's think about where does our intelligence come from? It does come from both the genes and environment. You have a pretty big genetic inheritance. That's probably most of your intelligence is, in fact, inherited. 60 to 85% of intelligence seems to be inherited from your mom and dad. Why is it such a broad range? Why do we not know a little bit better and able to pinpoint? Because this stuff isn't easy. There are, how would you do that? So let's think about how do we even know this? So let's think about identical twins. Identical twins are genetically exactly the same. They have the exact same DNA. These are the twins who look exactly the same, right? But here's the thing. If they were 100% identical, if your intelligence was totally from your genes, we would expect the correlation between those two siblings' IQ scores, because they're genetically the same, to be 1. But it's not. It's 0.85. That's ridiculously high for psychology. However, it is not a perfect correlation. This gap tells us that there was something environmental that causes their intelligence not to be perfectly correlated. This tells us there's an environmental influence. Okay, let's take fraternal twins. Fraternal twins are not biologically identical, but they have exactly the same environment, almost, right? Same womb, grow up the same, and their intelligence is correlated about a 0.6. Okay, now compare that to biological siblings. So fraternal twins and biological siblings both share half their genes in common. But the biological siblings had a little bit different environment. Their intelligence is slightly lower correlation because this is environmental. So sibling number 1 was born 3 years after sibling number 2, and mom and dad had more money, and so mom didn't have to work, and now she stays home and she invests in the kids. Or conversely, money got tighter and now they didn't have time for enriching activities. It could be anything. But this, the discrepancy between this and this, tells us there's something environmental. Finally, we can look at adoptive siblings. So these are siblings who are not sharing any of their genes in common, but they do share the same environment, and their IQs correlate at about 0.3 or so. So this is all environment, right? There's no genetic correlation here. This is all environment. So we might say that, maybe about 30% is environmental, and maybe about 70% is genetic. All right, hopefully you were with me on that. If you need to hear that again, just rewind and go back and listen. Feel free to reach out. So for your discussion board this week, I'll put some instructions, but generally speaking, I want you to go on the discussion board and share a little bit about your intelligence with other people, what where you think you're high in intelligence and where you think you're low in intelligence. And I want you to write it relatively vaguely. Like, I don't want you to refer specifically to the 3 theories. And then I want the response post to be, okay, I read your description of what you're good at and what you tend to be worse at, and I want people to pick one of the theories and apply it. So I might say, well, I'm very verbal. I sometimes struggle with math. I tend to forget. I tend not to be able to do mental math particularly well in my head. And so if I said something like that, and that's a little bit too short for our discussion board, but let me go back here. So I said I was good at verbal. I struggled with math because I had trouble keeping it all in my mind. So from a general intelligence standpoint, we might say that maybe I had a little bit difficulty with general memory. Maybe my memory span wasn't as good for the numbers. We might say that my crystallized intelligence for printed stuff was pretty high. We might say that I had pretty broad retrieval ability because I was pretty good with words. Here, we might say that I was linguistically smart, but lower on logical mathematical. And then here, we might say, well, maybe pretty good at analytical. But maybe I had written, well, I am a person who can, I went on a trip one time camping with friends, and we got a little bit lost in the woods, but we figured out how to make a fire and a shelter. And we survived the night until the next day. You might say, well, you must have good practical intelligence. Okay, so when you write your posts, I want you to be thinking about, I want you to gear it toward maybe all 3 of these, or maybe 1, maybe 2, hopefully not just 1. I want you to gear it where it could be understood as at least 2 of these, and then I want people to guess which 2 and kind of identify. Okay, I'll write those instructions out for you. I think it should be kind of fun. All right, to wrap up on intelligence, we need to think about intelligence testing. So intelligence testing looks at both aptitude and achievement. So your aptitude is your potential for learning. You are born with a certain aptitude. I tend to have higher aptitude for verbal. I have to work harder on math. Achievement is your acquired knowledge, or what you've actually learned. Achievement tends to be related to aptitude, so my verbal scores on the SAT and the GRE were higher than my math scores, for example, and the GRE and SAT are achievement tests. The original intelligence test was originated in 1904 with Alfred Binet in France. And he was trying to identify children who might need extra help. Louis Terman he was at Stanford University. He took Binet's original test and developed it in 1919 from the work of Binet and created the Stanford Binet test. I did use this test when I was in my intelligence testing class. David Wechsler created the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale in 1939 and was the first person to give intelligence tests to adults. He was looking at 2 factors of intelligence, your verbal skills and performance. Performance, think things like spatial and math and sequential reasoning. So this is an example of, I think this is from Wechsler. Could be from Stanford Binet. I can't remember off the top of my head. The task here is to identify the missing shape in the sequence. If it's on Wechsler, it's performance. So you have to look at all of these, and then you have to figure out what comes next. And the solution is the first triangle in the bottom row. So that's a sequential reasoning task, and this is the kind of thing that you're going to get on an intelligence test. It tends not to be read this passage or do this math problem. It's novel stuff that you've never seen before. Sorry, that was out of whack. Okay. So in terms of looking at intelligence tests, we have to look at 4 different factors to figure out if they're actually any good or not. So we look at validity. This is a little hearkening back to our research method stuff. If a test is valid, that means it measures what it intends to measure. So if I give you an intelligence test, but it doesn't actually tell me how intelligent you are, instead it tells me how many years of school you've been in, that's not a valid test. Reliability, the degree to which it produces consistent results. If I give you my intelligence test today, and then I also give it to you in 6 months, they really should be producing the same, pretty much the same result. Let me just think about this validity thing for one more second. Suppose I have an intelligence test, but it's so bound up with our school system that if I take it to a country where they're not in formal schooling, and then they come up in like the 30th percentile, that is not a valid test. We might be testing how much schooling you've been through as opposed to actually how intelligent you are. So that's why you do things like these sorts of tests for that. Standardization means that once you've got a test, you have to test it on a large sample and then figure out what's an average score. So an average score on an intelligence test is typically 100. So 100 IQ is average, and we might know the average scores for different ages or different generations, things like that. Then finally, the normal curve, and we'll get into that in just a second. This is the bell curve. Remember, the bell curve shows us the highest point of the distribution. Most intelligence tests run like a bell curve. So most people are kind of clustered around the middle. 100 is the average IQ, and it turns out that about 70% of people are between 85 and 115. Okay, so a standard deviation on an IQ test is 15 points. And so one standard deviation below 100 is 85, and one standard deviation above 100 is 115. So about 70% of people are between 85 and 115. Above that, 2 standard deviations above is 130. So about 14% of people are between 115 and 130, and then about 14% of people are between 85 and 70. And about 2% of people are at 130 or above. Here we're talking about 0.1% of people are above 145, 0.1% of people are below 55, and 2% of people are below 70. So below 85, it starts to become difficult to be a productive member of society, and you start to see more criminality. Below 70 is when we begin to talk about intellectual disability, or what used to be called mental retardation, but now we use the term intellectual disability. Up here, these people are very rare and very, very smart. So I thought I would share with you, I think Einstein's IQ was 168, as I recall. Okay, so most of us are around 100. 70% of people are between 85 and 115, and then about 95% of people are between 70 and 130. Okay, so there's that. And then lastly, the last thing I want to do on intelligence is talk about stereotype threat. So I'm going to share a very interesting video with you from Dr. Claude Steele. Now this is a little bit of a controversial concept, but I remember learning about this in graduate school, and I think it's very interesting, even though the idea has come under a little bit of scrutiny lately. But Claude Steele, listen to his video, and let me just kind of summarize stereotype threat for you, and then I want you to watch that video, and you will see some questions on the test about this. Here's the idea of stereotype threat. Claude Steele was wondering, why do some people perform worse on an IQ test than they should? Meaning, you know that they're equally well prepared as somebody else, but for some reason they perform worse. And it doesn't have to necessarily be an IQ test. It could be something else. So he'll talk about testing women in math. He says, look, there's a stereotype that men are better at math than women are. And we tend to find that sometimes women will do worse on the graduate record exam on the math portion, even though their grades were just as good, and we know that they were equally well prepared. And so we think they should have done equally well, but for some reason they didn't. And he says that he can turn this effect on and off. And he can turn it on, meaning women will score lower, if he triggers or raises the stereotype that women are worse than men at math. But he can also turn it off if he says to them, you may have heard that men do better on standardized math tests than women. And that's true of some tests, but it's not true of this particular test. And when he says that, then the effect turns off and they do in fact score the same. Here's another example. He'll share with you his research, but here's an interesting one. I know there's been research done on stereotype threat with basketball. So white men and black men and basketball. So what's the stereotype there? That white men can't jump. And so the stereotype is that the black men will do much better than the white men on basketball. And so what you do is you bring some black men and some white men in and you put them on different teams. And then what ends up happening is the black men will outperform the white men and will win the game. Now, here's the thing. We have to know before going into it that both groups of men had equal skills. We test them beforehand. We know they're equally good, but then we raise the stereotype by putting them on different teams. And then what happens is they become aware of the stereotype, and then they become anxious. Oh my gosh, am I going to live up to the stereotype? Are they going to beat us? They must be better than us. And when we're anxious, do we perform well? Do we perform as well as we could or should? No, we don't. So the women in the math test, they say, maybe you put men on one side of the room and women on the other side of the room. That's going to raise that stereotype, and you can get women to perform worse on the test by doing that. But we only know it's stereotype threat if we know going into it that they were in fact equally good. So with the basketball, we know that the both groups of men are equally good at basketball, but we raise the specter of the stereotype, and then the stereotype causes anxiety, and that causes the person to perform worse than they are capable of. Okay, so there's all kinds of stereotypes. Being old, being of a political persuasion, what color your hair is. There's all kinds of stereotypes, and those can impact us, and they do in fact impact us sometimes on IQ tests. So go ahead and watch the video from Claude Steele and know that the way it goes is they're equally good, the stereotype is raised, the person has anxiety about living up to the stereotype, and then they underperform. Okay, you got that? Equally good, stereotype is raised, anxiety about fulfilling it, and then they perform worse. That's the idea of stereotype threat. So take a look at Claude Steele's video. He's a lot of fun to listen to. Really one of the biggest names in psychology in the last 20 years or so. All right, I'll let you watch that video. Thank you. I appreciate you all. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Take care. I wish you well.